Hello, everyone. On behalf of RISD Students for Justice in Palestine, we want to thank you all for being here with us today for our virtual panel on Black liberation and Palestine solidarity. We also want to thank RISD SEI for their support and Professor Christopher Roberts for supporting this conversation. We want to start the event with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that RISD and Brown University alike are built and reside on the lands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people, and that these institutions were built by the forced labor of Black and Indigenous peoples. It's within RISD and Brown's responsibilities as academic institutions to disseminate knowledge about our institution's history, and we want this land acknowledgement to serve as a reminder for ourselves that fighting for justice means a commitment to fighting for justice everywhere. This panel aims to reflect on and further mobilize the long-standing solidarity between Black and Palestinian peoples in our continuing and indivisible struggle against white supremacist, settler-colonial, racist carceral states, and in our solidarities against forms of structural violence that we've been living under for decades and continue to endure today. As an art and design institution, one thing a lot of our student body should be thinking about is the role of design in activism, creating racial justice through our literary and visual work, and why that's important. That means that we have to constantly think about taboos in our fields, what can or cannot be presented, visualized, materialized, and when and how to get away from that. Along those lines, we wanted to bring up the fact that today, we're holding this panel over the digital corporate platform of Zoom, who just recently on the 23rd of September, blocked and deplatformed an online open classroom featuring Palestinian freedom fighter Layla Khalid. The panel was called Whose Narratives, Gender, Justice, and Resistance, a Conversation. And one of the organizers is Professor Rabab Delhadi, who is here with us today. And it was co-sponsored by the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at the University of San Francisco State. We're left having to hold this panel over Zoom still because of our institutions, and it brings up the role that technology companies can play in the larger context of Zionist and patriarchal repression of Palestinian speech, specifically when we narrate feminist narratives. This censorship is a part of a wider censorship of Palestine in the US, and it's especially discomforting during the pandemic as we continue to use digital spaces to narrate and voice opposition to oppressive systems. We'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists, starting first with Dr. Rabab Delhadi, who is the founding director, senior scholar of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at SFSU, and co-founding editorial board member of Islamophobia Studies Journal, lead editor of book volumes and author of over 80 articles and book chapters. She received her PhD from Yale University and has received many scholarly awards and community honors, including Sterling Fellowship, New Century Scholarship, and National Women's Studies Association. She is compiling critical oral histories of Palestinian activism and editing an anthology on teaching Palestine, roundtables on Black liberation, abolition and reparations, and Whose Narrative, Gender, Justice, and Palestine, censored by Zoom due to Zionist campaign and university collusion. Matshidiso Matsuneng is a researcher at the Afro-Middle East Center based in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is currently completing a Master of Arts in Political Science at the University of Johannesburg. She previously worked for the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute in Johannesburg, working on local economic development and the advancement of socioeconomic rights. Her interests include gender and war studies, geopolitical issues pertaining to the Middle East and Africa. She is also a longtime activist for social justice. Emory Douglas was politically involved as revolutionary artist and then minister for the Black Panther Party of Culture from February 1967 until the 1980s. His art and design concepts were always seen on the front and back pages of the Black Panther Newspaper, reflecting the politics of the Black Panther Party and the concerns of the community. A retrospective of Douglas's graphic artwork was published in 2007 titled Black Panther, The Revolutionary Art of Emory Douglas, and his work has been widely distributed and exhibited around the world. He is also a receiver of the American Institute of Graphic Art Lifetime Achievement Medal in New York. And finally, we have Nirzin Keswani, who is a Palestinian organizer from New York City. She is the founder and chair of Within Our Lifetime, United for Palestine, a community-based Palestinian-led organization whose goal is to revitalize the revolutionary spirit of the Palestinian community abroad in pursuit of a free homeland. She is also a second-year law student at CUNY School of Law, where she organizes with Students for Justice in Palestine. Each of our speakers tonight will speak for around 15 to 20 minutes, and after that, we'll have around a half hour left for a Q&A session. Throughout the event, you can post questions you have in the chat and direct them at a certain speaker or open it generally. We're very honored and excited that they've each accepted our invitations tonight, and without further ado, we would like to invite Dr. Rabab Delhadi to begin.
Good evening, and I also add my name to acknowledging that we are working, living, and existing on stolen indigenous peoples' land. San Francisco State University sits on the stolen land of the Ohlone people, and many of us actually come from contexts of this sort. I'm very thankful to all of you for hosting us here today. I also want to add my protest about having to have this platform on Zoom. And it is a very big issue that we should actually have a discussion around it. What does it mean when we are working, when we are basically a captive audience to a multinational monopoly that basically has veto over the content of our classroom, allows and doesn't allow other people. And when our universities actually stand aside and allow Zoom to do that, what does this mean for education? What does it mean for our work? And I will continue talking about that as part of the theme of my presentation. You mentioned, Aya, in your introduction that the censored webinar that we've had on September 23rd, that I co-organized with my colleague Tomomi Kinakawa from Women and Gender Studies, was actually focusing on narratives. And this is what we are trying to do. We're actually trying to think about what narratives are, whose narratives are being upheld, whose narratives are being silenced. What do we make of history? What do we make of every single issue we're discussing? So my work is going to be framed by that. I draw on my experience as a long-term activist. I'm a long-time activist before I became an academic. Actually, one of the reasons I went to get my PhD is because I was talking, people were not paying attention. So I thought, okay, if I'll add the DR in front of my name, maybe people will listen. I mean, we're still being silenced, right? So it's not really about academic degrees or lack of academic degrees. It's the narrative itself and the whole question of justice, the quest for justice that's being silenced. And we know that from our histories, and I'm going to talk about all of that. So I'm an activist. I've worked for a very long time, especially in the US, and I was mentored, and I had many sisters, brothers, comrades, colleagues from Black and other communities, Black community, Indigenous community, other communities of color, Asian Americans, Latinx, anti-Zionist, Jewish, and there are a lot of people who are basically uphold working class, poor people, and so on. So I'll draw on some of that experience. I also draw on some of my scholarship that I have been also studying and working on and researching the question of Black Palestinian solidarities, and specifically, historically, the Black communities' support on and statements on Palestine. And actually, we just want to take the opportunity to invite everybody to join us next Sunday, November 1st at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard, which will be 1 p.m. in the East Coast and 9 p.m. in Palestine, for commemorating the 50th anniversary of the New York Times statement of Black radicals and Black leaders on Palestine. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I think that's a very, very important statement. So I will leave that. We have had discussions, many of us here on this panel, of that, but to ask you to join. So I've been actually researching that. And I've been also wondering, what does it mean when we say actually Black? Are we talking about Black Americans? Are we talking about Black people? Are we talking about people who refer to themselves as African Americans? Are we talking about Blacks in the continent of Africa? Are we talking about the name that is referred to? But that's something that we can discuss. What does this mean? But I'm talking about a very big community that has historically mostly stood by Palestinians and supported them. I also draw my inspiration from my role as an educator at San Francisco State. San Francisco State University is home to the longest strike in the history of the United States. 1968 students struck. They were led by the Black Panther Party. They were led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front. So many of the people here are actually, there's a lot of intersections here. And the strike came about in 1968 because students said that we want to decolonize the curriculum. We want to have an education that's relevant to our lives. We want to make our education accountable to the communities. And this is what we're doing. And I believe this is what we're doing. And this is one of the things that inspires me here today. And this also comes from my project of teaching Palestine, pedagogical praxis, and the indivisibility of justice. And this is a project in which two of my colleagues have actively participated, and the third one has actually participated in let's say, euphemistically and in generally and so on. So what I wanted to speak, and I want to kind of give a few examples and then just draw some general remarks in order for me to stick to the time, and then we can have a broader, there is a lot to discuss here. So on the morning after we arrived in Palestine in 2011, and we were in a place called Sana Nablus, in my hometown, Nablus, on the mountain. It was a Friday morning. We did not expect many people to come. It was in 2011. In her introduction to herself, Angela Davis got up and said that one of the things that sustained me in prison, when she was in prison, was a letter that she received from Palestinian prisoners. And none of us knew that. None of us on the delegation knew that this was the Indigenous Women of Color Feminist delegation. None of us in the Palestinian movement knew about that. None of us in the broader movement knew about that. Few days later, and so she spoke about what does it mean for 18 months in prison? What does it mean to actually receive a letter? A few days later, we were going to Jerusalem. And as we descended the bus, there was a Palestinian leader in Jerusalem who was meeting us, a former political prisoner. And I was said, well, this is the way Angela introduced herself. And we were visiting members of the Palestinian Legislative Council who were being expelled from Jerusalem, deported by Israel, in order to deepen the Israeli project of emptying Jerusalem of its Palestinian residents. And the prisoner actually was one of the people who actually authored the statement to Angela Davis, Yaqub Ode. And he said to her, so Angela, the statement was really helpful to you. And it was sort of like people coming together. A few years later, 5 years later, we were, and my comrade Emery Douglas and I were on the delegation to Palestine in 2016, which was the first US prisoner solidarity delegation. And we can talk about that some more, but one of the things that was the highlights of the moment was that we organized a conference along with the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, at which when we were sitting there, we received a collect call. One of our comrades, Johanna Fernandez, received the collect call, and it was from Mumia Abu Jamal, from his prison cell, actually called in order to wish the participants good luck and to actually express solidarity with Palestine from calling a collect call. So these are expressions, but these are not new expressions. And we can speak more about that. And I'm sure also probably Emery and Sidi will also elaborate on the delegations they've been on. But this history goes a very, very long time. This history of Black solidarity with Palestine, of Palestinian solidarity with the struggle against racism, against settler colonialism, against the US as a nation, a settler colonial nation state, racist, engaged in kidnapping and enslaving people from their own homelands in Africa. This is not as well known as the solidarity now today, but it goes long earlier, much earlier than 2014, when there was a lot of solidarity after the murder of Michael Brown and the murder of Muhammad Abu Khdeir and other Palestinians, and the Israeli war on Gaza, the multiple wars. It goes a very long time ago, and it goes also earlier than some of the sparks when Trayvon Martin was also murdered, and where there's a big movement coming out of it. For me, it goes to my own personal thing. It goes for me into 1983 when I first met Betty Shabazz, and I didn't really know who she was, but this was the only place in New York City, Medgar Evers College, where we as Palestinians were welcome to speak at an International Women's Day. We were not welcome to speak anywhere else. And it actually brings questions about the whole question of gender, resistance, colonialism, racism, and so on, that were part of the questions that we wanted to raise on the panel that was censored, but also some of the questions, and I think some of the students raised questions here today. It goes back to the African Caribbean Resource Center in New York City that was headed by the Caribbean man who passed away, Maury Marksman, who was also the director of the WBI Pacifica station in New York. It goes back to Elambe Brath, the founder of the Patrice Lumumba Coalition, who used to go every week, used to organize events at the Harriet Tubman High School, and also always invited Palestinians and Arab. It goes back to organizing with many of the sisters and brothers from South Africa around the whole question of the anti-apartheid movement. And I was happy to have been initiated a big project called Israel and South Africa, the Apartheid Connection in 1985. But it also goes back to the coasts what the cause that people involved in supporting Palestine solidarity engage in. And I will speak a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about the other side of the equation from Palestine, the solidarity that historically Palestinians, especially Palestinians who are involved in the anti-colonial movement, recognize the struggle of people against colonialism, racism, imperialism in the US. And some of the stuff actually rose up. I mean, for me, I lived through the 60s, rose really and emerged, especially during the US imperialist intervention in Vietnam. And one of the highest examples for Palestinians was Muhammad Ali, who refused to serve in Vietnam and said, I'm not going to go and intervene, and so on, as well as the statement that we will be discussing on Sunday. That will be the 50th anniversary of the statement in the New York Times. It also brought home to the Palestinian, what does it mean when people actually refuse to participate in the interests of colonialism? But also there were a lot of issues coming up in the 60s, whether it was the Black Panthers going to Algeria to organize. And one of the speakers that we've had on the 23rd was actually Sekou Odinga, who was one of the people who was sent by the Black Panthers to Algeria to organize with people that way. And that's where, by the way, also Palestinians and Black Panthers went with Nelson Mandela and the South African fighters. I mean, this is kind of like, it's very, very interesting to also think about the oral histories and the network analysis of how people come together and where do they come and what issues they're raising. And this has been mentioned a lot, but from our own perspective, I was growing up and my school was called Jamila Bouhaired. That was named after one of the Algerian women who was in prison and tortured, Jamila Bouhaired. And we used to get up every morning as kids and not do the Palestinian anthem. We actually used to do the Algerian anthem every single day. Well, like we knew it by heart. And it was support for the Algerian movement and the Algerian, and of course, we can always talk more about Fanon's analysis, yes, Frantz Fanon's analysis around the whole question of Algerian decolonizing the wretched of the earth, dying colonialism and so on, but also his own work around the whole question of the African revolutionaries and the writings in the Mujahid newspaper, as well as his writing about black skin, white mass and so on. And so there were a lot of things that were happening at that time that I do remember when I was growing up. People probably know the story, is that when I was growing up, when Angela Davis was in prison, my mother thought that Angela Davis was framed. And when it was a question, why was she framed? She said, of course she's black, of course she's going to be framed. It's, something that I've also later on written about, but this is some of the things that are actually very much part and parcel of what's going on. And for both the Palestinians and the black liberation, as well as all people fighting against liberation, it doesn't go without cause. How am I doing for time? Hi, Aya. Am I good? Because I have a few things to say. All right, okay. So it is not without cause. So I really want to actually link what we began to talk about with where it's here. And of course, I can expand on everything, and so can my colleagues. So this is not without cause. So some of the people we're actually you're going to meet on November 1st are actually, some of them have lost their jobs. I mean, Professor Sam Anderson, after he edited that statement that was in the New York Times, he was told by the president of Sarah Lawrence College, where he was teaching and actually trying to build a department for Black Studies. They brought him for that. Told him, you don't really need to come every week. Come once a week. And then little by little, he never ever got a 10-year job. The same thing happened in 1985 with Professor Fred Dube, who was a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. And he was one of the people who was working with us on this. And Professor Dube was fired from his job by the previous governor of New York, Cuomo, the father of this one here, because he gave a lecture of 1 hour, 1/3 of which was on Zionism. But we also discovered that there is a lot of stuff in the congressional record around our collaboration, because we did 26-city tour on Israel, South Africa, the apartheid connection. And the anti-apartheid activists actually stood always by the Palestinians, always stood by the Palestinians, even refused when the anti-apartheid movement became so hot and quote unquote sexy and everybody wanted to participate in it. They refused to give up on the Palestinians. They said, no, we're not going to abandon the Palestinian. The Palestinian struggle is our struggle. And they stood fast. And the other people that will be participating, some of them, for example, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and 2 people will be participating on Sunday, both Fran Beal and Phil Hutchins. Fran will talk about also the Third World Women's Alliance. She was very much involved in it. And Phil was actually the chair of SNCC when SNCC made its statement on Palestine and basically lost all its funding, all of a sudden, and they will talk about actually the ethnography of what exactly happened and their oral histories. And this goes much earlier, and it connects very much just like what happened with Mark Lamont Hill when he spoke at the United Nations a couple of years ago on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Mark Lamont Hill was fired from CNN. And actually one of the Zionist groups back in the spring, they did a webinar and they said that Mark Lamont Hill, when he says, he said, oh, Mark Lamont Hill says from the river, Palestine will be free from the river, to say, this is a Hamas position and so on. And as well, of course, I mean, forget about historical accuracies. The Zionists don't really care about that. This is the same thing that they've done with our webinar as well. But this is a slogan that Palestinians have raised a very, very long time ago, way before actually Hamas was founded in 1987. But the reason the Zionists say that, because it's actually very fitting to use Islamophobic, quote unquote, war and terror discourses that became very popular by the US and the Israeli government, especially post 9/11/2001, to actually draw on all these racist Islamophobic tropes in order to mobilize people and so on. So that they don't actually say that Mark Lamont Hill is a black scholar. He's very well known, very established and so on. And he got up and he basically reproduced a slogan that Palestinians have been saying all along. It's not something new. Palestinians, and all this, the statistics and surveys, Palestinians say that, but they actually say it's a Hamas, in order for them to kind of just have this very sort of like a soundbite that is very lazy, that basically immediately builds and sings to the imaginary, the Islamophobic imaginary and other racist imaginaries, the same way in which white supremacists and racists actually have called movement for Black Lives, have called people who are participating in the uprisings that they are terrorists. And actually the FBI created now, you know, there is a counter-terrorism, a new one, not the Contil Pro from the 60s. There is a new one that's actually targeting people who are protesting because the police are killing people. The police are killing youth. I mean, everybody watched the video from George Floyd. Nobody can actually doubt what happened. Everybody knows what has happened. But in order to suppress the tale, the narrative of the people who are A, colonized and marginalized, and B, who are resisting and fighting for their rights and so on. The same thing happened with Angela Davis when she was awarded this very important award in her hometown in Birmingham. And then all of a sudden the award was rescinded. I mean, it was rescinded. And then we discovered that the board of that place actually had a very impromptu phone call and decided they're going to take away the award from her because of she speaks about Palestine and because she supports boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is the simplest thing people can do in order for them to actually denormalize an oppressive situation. I mean, it's kind of like when I say normalization, normalization is making something normal or that's wrong, you know? So actually, this is the history of not only the South African movement, this is the history of the US movement, this is the history of the lunch counters and Woolworth. Last year, actually, we went and we visited when we were in North Carolina. This is the history of struggle everywhere. When you know something is wrong, but you actually have to raise protest. You can't say that the participation in Zoom is business as usual. You cannot normalize it. You have to protest and you have to find ways to hold people accountable so they don't continue perpetuating all of this. And this is the same thing that is actually also happening today. And it happened also in the, to talk about the history of the education. This also has happened in the past, which with Ocean Hill-Brownsville, for example. There was a very big struggle here in New York City in 1968 by parents, Black and Puerto Rican parents, wanting to actually have some control over the curriculum that their kids are learning in an area called Ocean Hill-Brownsville in New York City. And they protested, and then some of the teachers were actually with them. Some of the teachers said we're going, some of the teachers were actually protesting and they had a picket line. And some of the teachers who were designers teachers who did not agree with community control and community accountability of the education that the kids were learning, which is very similar to 1968 strike at San Francisco State, basically went and actually reproduced thousands of flyers. I think it was maybe 500,000. And I've just read a new article about that with the people made a documentary about it. 500,000 flyers that is supposed to be on behalf of the Black and Puerto Rican parents making anti-Semitic remarks. And we know this, and the reason I'm mentioning that then, because the same thing is being reproduced today, that every single time somebody comes up and speaks about justice in Palestine, against racism, against colonization of indigenous lands, against injustice anywhere, And I'm not going to kind of like speak about other contexts because my comrades will speak about that. But every single time there is a silencing mechanisms grow, rise from defamation, from smearing, from outsourced distortion, from taking things out of context, from making it sound as if you said something that you really didn't sound, from cutting. And I can also, I can easily share so many stories from my experience, but that's not the topic today. But again and again and again, every single person, every single group that comes up, Movement for Black Lives came up with a platform in support of BDS. They were slandered left and right by the same white supremacist, Islamophobic, racist, Zionist groups like David Horowitz, like Campus Watch Middle East Forum, like AMCHA, like the Anti-Defamation League, and so on. All of them are trying to delegitimize the struggles of the people for their liberation, for their freedom, and their collaboration and coalition and solidarity with each other, support for each other, by using all these smears and so on. And if all else fails, they have lawsuits, they file lawsuits. If all else fails, they actually try to, like what they accuse of material support for terrorism. None of it, by the way, is, but even with the limitations of the US law, the US law does not even cover that. This is something in order to scare people who are not necessarily involved, to say, don't even participate. Don't even participate. These people are defeated. And this is also comes along with the whole question of propagating the narrative that Palestinians have been defeated, which actually contradicts history, because Palestinians, at the very least, from the time of British colonialism until the present, have been resisting. So if there were no Palestinians, nobody will be speaking about them. The Palestinians exist, they're fighting everything, they're resisting it over at least 100 years of colonialism. And actually, the Zionism is actually much younger. The movement, Zionist movement, is actually much younger than that. But there is also an attempt, and maybe I will just say this and have one more topic comment, and I will stop, just to make sure that everybody else gets a chance, so I can fit within my time and be disciplined. But with the Zionist movement, this is the same thing also, is that one aspect of it is smearing, labeling us with terrorism, labeling us with Islamophobic tropes, and so on. All of us, by the way, this whole question is actually, it's all equal opportunity, basically, racists and white supremacists and oppressors and so on. The other aspect of it is very context specific to Palestine, in the sense that for the Zionist movement was one response by multiple people who were trying to fight anti-Semitism, the same way we want to fight racism, we want to fight white supremacy, we want to fight exploitation, we want to fight poverty, everything, climate degradation. You always come up with different formulas. There's all sorts of different formulas. Zionism was one answer. There were many other answers that came to respond to anti-Semitism. One of the things that I believe in is actually coming all together and fighting against all forms of racism and racial discrimination, not just one, not exceptionalizing one, not exceptionalizing Zionism, not exceptionalizing Israel, but actually, or Palestine, subjecting all of us to the same thing and coming together and fighting with each other. The struggles are never the same, of course, and so we don't conflate history or context, but they actually connect with each other. People identify with each other. They have shared understandings of what the struggle means and what justice means and how we need to support each other. And that's exactly what is happening. And that is exactly why breaking these coalitions is very, very important for those who are oppressing us. So what Zionism comes in and actually says, this is anti-Semitic. If you speak against Zionism, if you speak for Palestinian justice, if you say people should actually support justice in for Palestine, if you say that people should actually support boycott, divestment, sanctions, then you are anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism equal anti-Semitism. And we say this is actually not true, because if you actually say that all the Jews across time and place, from the time Moses and David and all the prophets actually came, actually had one single experience, that in itself is anti-Semitic. That's how what anti-Semitism means, is saying you brush with the same brush all the experiences of people, say, oh, you're all the same, you're all the same, you all look the same, you all feel the same, you all think the same, and so on. Actually, what we say, one of the things that we always say is that who owns Jewishness? Zionists definitely do not, and Zionism is a passing phenomenon. Zionism is a recent phenomenon. Don't think that it's going to be there forever and ever. Like all racist ideologies, also going to get defeated and so on. But for the Zionist movement, it's very, very important to claim that they speak for all Jews, which is actually not true. And this is also one of the reasons with our webinar on the September 23rd, for example, they completely erase that half of the panel were two Jewish anti-Zionists. One is Comrade Ronnie Kasrilis from South Africa, who Sidi knows really well. And the other one was Comrade Laura Whitehorn, who's a former political prisoner who was on the same delegation that Emery and I were to Palestine and met with Palestinian prisoners in 2016, where Mumi Abu Jamal called us and so on. So there is kind of completely erasing them too, because making them, acknowledging that they are part of the narrative, means that the question for justice for Palestine is not the monopoly of the Palestinians. It is not a Palestinian issue. Palestine is an issue for everybody. The same way as the whole question of liberation, we never ever say, and it will be like the worst thing to say, oh, you know, only Black people need to worry about racism and slavery. Why? Everybody should be worrying about it. This is a problem for everyone. This is a problem for humanity. And I'm not saying this is our problem. It's a problem for humanity. The whole humanity should come together and actually address it and struggle against it. And Zionism tried to do the same thing too. It's actually say, oh, this is only the Jews. Palestinians are against Arabs and Muslims, and also the whole Islamophobic and racist things, and which we can discuss. But this is the whole purpose of it. And what we're trying to do by talking about it, and I want to end at that, is that one of the things to do it is to actually produce knowledge for justice. Place justice as the center of our knowledge production, that we do not want to actually produce knowledge in order for us to have more nuclear bombs, in order to kill people, in order to deprive people of their livelihood, in order to teach people how they can actually cannibalize more neighborhoods and how they can actually make people more homeless and engage more in quote unquote, don't even like to call it gentrification, because it means from gentle people, the gentry and so on. I think it's a misnomer. So this is what they're trying to do. And this is what we do instead, is we actually engage in critical discussions. We don't have to agree. We can debate and fight and agree and disagree with each other. But this is why the Zionists were so much interested in shutting down the microphone on September 23rd, which was a statement that was actually issued by participants in the week before webinar, which was on the Sabra and Shatila massacre, at which survivors of the massacre, Palestinians, survivors who were non-Palestinians, medical people, people who are doing the research and so on, all came together. And they all spoke about what happens in a massacre and how we should not forget, and we should memorialize the victims, acknowledge, have accountability, hold the perpetrators accountable, in order for us to actually build a different world. And for them, they wanted to silence that, because shutting down the microphone does not enable people to think critically and engage in justice-centered knowledge production. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabab, for getting us started. And I feel like there hears a slight echo here, but thank you for those comments. And at this time, we're going to transition to the next speaker that we have, and want everybody to give your attention to Matshidiso Motsoeneng. Thank you for coming and being with us today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. My fellow panelists, Rabab, it's really nice to be on the same platform with you. Again, Mr. Emery, a pleasure to be with you. Nadine, I think I was supposed to have met you 2 years ago at a conference, and unforeseen circumstances prohibited that, but I'm glad that we have this opportunity to be together. I'm very honored to have received the invitation to be part of this. When I saw the topic, Black liberation and Palestine solidarity, it kind of brought a lot of things into context for me. Being a Black woman living in, what is called liberated South Africa at this day and age, in the African continent, where we are experiencing what Rabab has just alluded to, normalization with Israel of so many African countries is going on in the continent, but it's also happening in the context of, South Africa. I mean, when you think about Black liberation, we speak about racism, capitalism, imperialism, and state power in the context of South Africa. Post 1994, where we have attained what has been called political liberation, but yet we still struggle for, economic liberation, if I put it that. And as a Black woman, I am, in the group of mostly affected people in terms of economic inequality and poverty in the African continent, perpetuated, of course, by the history of colonialism, settler-colonialism, and apartheid in South Africa, which continues, unfortunately, to this day. Being a South African woman also brings a lot of things to perspective for me in terms of the Palestinian struggle because of the centrality of the land question. The South African history is a history of land dispossession, genocide, forced displacement in the South African context and the rest of the African context, and the Palestinian struggle resonates heavily with that. But also, as Rabab has said, there is a lot of history of Black liberation movements with the Palestinian struggle. The support for Palestine continues to this day. Unfortunately, a lot of former liberation movements in the African continent who once stood very firmly with Palestinians and supported the Palestinian struggle are, have really kind of, if you want to say, ignored or left many of those historical roots. An example and a case in point, a very recent case in point, is the ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, which has, recently appointed an Israeli citizen as their ambassador to Israel. This Israeli citizen is now involved in getting mining contracts, further exploiting and extracting the African continent, as has been the history of colonialism, imperialism, and neoliberal capitalism that continues to this day in the African continent. So when I went to Palestine with Dr. Rabab in 2018, I focused on learning the experiences of Palestinians living in this apartheid. A lot of people like to be embroiled in debates of whether or not we can say it's apartheid or not, but I think that's just a diversion and really a political ploy to move away from what is happening in Palestine, which is apartheid. I mean, in the South African context, we're not very shy to call it apartheid Israel, because that's what it is. Having been, the people that went through this, we know the historical links between Israel and apartheid government and the nuclear weapons program, that the two actually help each other build. South Africa signed the treaty in post-94 to disarm their nuclear weapons, but they remain in the country as a legacy and the memory of this very cruel past that the South African apartheid government had with Israel. Unfortunately, some of those links have gone through the post-apartheid era in South Africa, to which we are still fighting against even today. The fight for this, for breaking up the links between South Africa and Israel continue not only in the political circles, they continue in everyday life of South Africans. Israeli companies are taking over South African companies, further exploiting South African workers. They are in South African campuses, repressing and forcing university management to silence and police student activism. When I was in my undergrad studies at Wits University in 2009, 2010, 2013, up to 2015, we experienced quite a lot of university repression coming from Zionist funders to the university that pressed management to silence, mostly Black voices for Palestine on campus, but also silence Black struggles on campus, which always draw the links and the parallels to the Palestinian struggle. So when you speak about Black liberation, you cannot somehow divorce everything else from it, because, as I said, the topic of racism, capitalism, imperialism, and state power features heavily into it. And the Palestinian struggle is very important to Black struggles because it is inherently intertwined, inherently linked. So in the South African context, you know, the history of apartheid in which you come from has given us many lessons. Lessons, of course, that continue to this day. I highly doubt, having been born 8 months after Nelson Mandela was released from prison, believe that my struggle for justice is even anywhere close to ending. And you know, with the advancements of capitalism, I mean, with, you know, fascist white supremacy at its height, a lot of those things are playing out quite very starkly in South Africa, especially against the Black majority in this country. The US, nannying of Israel is also, quite well entrenched in how African governments do their foreign policy and conduct their foreign affairs with, big Western states such as the United Kingdom and the United States. Trump, having been the president, has gotten into this whole trying to really give airtime to something that's quite non-existent in South Africa, which people, white Afrikaner, former oppressors in this country call farm murders or white genocide. Really something that's non-existent, not even in reality. South Africa has one of the highest murder rates in the world, and white people actually form not even, I think they don't even form like 5% of those murder rates. Black people being the most, poverty-stricken, most marginalized, still experience the violent crimes that this country has inherited as the legacy of apartheid, settler-colonialism, and colonialism. So there is quite a lot of, the global struggle for justice that translates itself on the ground in everyday South African issues and South African struggles, Black struggles, Black people's struggles for emancipation and independence. And as I said when I started my presentation, it's also a picture that's also playing itself out in many of the African continents. As I said, even though there are very wide historical links between African liberation movements and the PLO and Palestinian struggle, a lot of that is sort of withering away because of, as I said, the advancement of capitalism, but a huge encroachment of imperialism and capitalism in the continent. So Israel is really on this wide campaign in the African continent to get African states to normalize relations with them through, enticing them with technological software, agriculture, and most of all is the arms sales to many of these African countries. As I said, Zimbabwe started in the mid-2000s, buying anti-riot equipment and gear from Israel to suppress dissidents in Zimbabwe against, the ruling ZANU-PF. A lot of political opposition members experienced physical violence, etc., through, deals that the ZANU-PF, a former liberation movement that was very supportive of Palestine, supportive of other liberation struggles in the continent, had acquired from Israel to now oppress their own citizens, the very same citizens that they had fought alongside with against the imperialist power of colonialism, etc. So we see quite a lot of this links with growing imperialism and capitalism in the continent as well. Regional bodies such as the African Union, have mostly reduced Palestinian support to rhetoric and statements, and really resolutions, but not really much is translating on the ground. Whereas on the one side, Israel has really accelerated its strategy of what they call economic diplomacy, in the continent, you know, through, again, like the system of colonization before them, which focuses on extraction of Africa's raw materials, extraction of Africa's resources for its own benefit with very little gain for Africans themselves. And there is quite a lot of, you know, misconstrued perspectives and knowledge that's being disseminated in the continent about, you know, Israel and normalizing relations with Israel. When you look at the continent, out of all the 54 states, you still have very few countries that are very vocal on Palestine, South Africa being one of the ones in the forefront. Algeria follows closely behind that, in regional bodies, etc. But there has been quite a lot of those historical gains and historical ties between the Palestinian struggle and African liberation struggles and movements has been lost. I mean, in the South African continent, in the South African context, you know, the fact that we really a young democracy, we just really got like our independence in 1994, I was only 4 years old, has given us the platform to confront this, you know, the state view of Israel pursuing state interests before the overall support for Palestine, but also pursuing justice for its own citizens. The Israeli company, I think the Central Bottling Company, through its subsidiary Milko, just recently acquired one of South Africa's largest dairy companies, Clover. And this, you know, the acquisition and the transaction of this transaction was highly opposed by, you know, activists on the ground, by student organizations, labor movements, which are quite strong in the South African context, thanks to, of course, the liberation history that we come from. It still managed to pass through the Competition Tribunal of South Africa, allowed for the transaction to go ahead, and Milko acquired Clover. So as activists, we have, of course, embarked on a widespread boycott campaign, especially because since the takeover of Milko by Clover, 500 workers at Clover stand to lose their jobs. You know, one worker has already been shot and killed by police officers before protesting for a living wage and stuff. So we know that wherever Israel is, this is the legacy of the Zionist occupation of Palestine is genocidal. It kills workers, it refuses to pay workers a living wage, but it also continues the injustice of economic inequality that was created under, you know, the settler colonialism that started in the 1600s, colonialism that followed with the British occupation of South Africa, and the apartheid system that came in 1948 still continues to this day. And Israel is pretty much very happy to enter into these transactions because it allows for it to continue the system of oppression and dispossession of Black people. So I think that will be my 2 cents, and I'll give other panelists a chance. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mashadisu, for the commentary. Also, thank you for drawing the linkages between Dr. Rabab's commentary and your own, specifically correlations of state power and how they manifest in different locations. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to pass it over to Mr. Emery Douglas. Thank you very much for being here, and the space is yours, sir. Oh, you're muted right now, I think, yeah.
Delighted to be here with all of the distinguished guests today. I'm going to come from the colonization of the imagination in the context of art being guided by principles. But I want to start off in the context of talking about the historical solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people. That goes back to the days of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s, when we had always in our paper, we always showed context in the international section about solidarity with the struggles that were going on in Palestine, in Africa and Asia, and all around the world during that time. Matter of fact, you had Huey Newton, who went to Palestine back in the day. Myself, I was, when I traveled to Kathleen Cleaver to go to Algeria, when Algiers Cleaver was coming from Cuba. And we were initially invited to have Panthers in exile there, because then Algeria didn't have one of those extradition connections with the United States. And so when I was there, we were there, and we had the opportunity then, at that time in historical context, with Yasser Arafat, who was there for a conference. And they said we had, through our connections there, we set it up to meet with him. And thereafter, you had other Panthers who came through there, who also met him and other representatives and delegations from Palestine. So I'm also had the opportunity to go with Sister Rabab to be invited to be a part of a delegation. I believe it was 2016. Amazing delegation, political prisoners, ex-political prisoners, labor workers, scholars. This allegation was an amazing delegation. And the word got out that you had everybody who wanted to meet with the delegation. I think that might be one of the delegations why they put such pressure on Rabab today, was that delegation, and what the statement that came out from that delegation was published in about 4 different languages sent around the world in that context. So it was a very powerful experience for myself to meet with the Black Palestinian Africans who were part of the liberation movement there, to understand and see some of the things, a mirror image of what you see in here, where there were roads that Palestinians go on, they would be killed, could be wiped out, all those kinds of things. Seeing the Gaza and how all that, West Bank, how that, all that metal and open air prison, seeing all those things. So all that was a very powerful experience. Firsthand experience, observation for myself. So, but I want to go on, I'm gonna share my screen and go into a few of the, talk about slides and show you the context of in relationship to art and how that it builds with mental bondage and breaking up the colonization of the imagination. Okay. Okay, I'll go down here. I got to find out where I got to go down here. Okay. Oh, here I go. Okay, no. Take me one second, please. Trying to get to, I'm going to start off with the more recent images to give you some context so you can get a feel of what it is. I just put this in because it's a Panther symbol, remixed, but it's a powerful film because it comes from the South during the Civil Rights Movement, Lowndes County, Alabama, when they were, after 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. In Lowndes County, you had Stokely Carmichael and many other SNCC members went to that county to begin to register Black folks who were sharecroppers. Most of them couldn't read or write and lived in a plantation environment, but they wanted to vote, but they didn't want to be a part of the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party. So they started a Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And they had to have an icon, just like the racists had an icon, a white rooster, which stood for white supremacy. And so they seen these high school sports teams, like you see lions, all the different animals names of sports teams, and they chose the Panther. So the symbol from the Panther comes from the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and it worked its way up to the North. This is one of, I call this Malcolm X the Warrior. This is a remix, and symbolically everybody knowing who Brother Malcolm was and what he stood for. And you see it when you're doing these kinds of images, it's beginning to, and then there's discussions behind it, those things that go on. that it's about dealing with the colonization of the imagination. This is just a recent one I did on October 15, 1966, was when the Black Panther Party was co-founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. He changed the name from Black Panther Party to Self-Defense in 1968 because it got more into political stuff and social programs and many other things to deal with, again, decolonization, the imagination of the mentality of the community by service programs, by the things we were involved in, all those things. And so on October 15th of this year was the anniversary of the commemoration. There again, Dr. King to your right and Brother Malcolm to your left, Dr. King, who also came to acknowledge that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth was the United States government. These community, you have to put community folks in there in a context, because if you want them to identify with your language and what you're talking about, what you have to say on a broader scale and on a political scale, they have to begin to see themselves in the artwork, and also they will listen to what you have to say. But these are remixes of those interpretations. I'm going to get to some others as well. I just wanted to show you. Here's one here. We are living in the land of plenty, while we the people starve. So this transcends borders in the context that people can see that there's something about the quality of life that's integrated into the work itself. Don't support the greedy, these kinds of things. Sharecroppers. I'm gonna get to some more informative. Educate to liberate. This is what we're talking about. Educate to liberate. Decolonization of the imagination. Turtle Island, North America, indigenous territory. All this is called Turtle Island, all North America. This is indigenous American Indian territory. Health is wealth. I like this saying, yeah, it's non-toxic. So we have to have those components, because we're talking about the COVID-19 and all those things. We have to, all that plays into liberation and the colonization of the imagination. Here you have, young people, I'm food insecure. I'm homeless. Here's one showing the different, we had the 45th year anniversary of the Panthers, and it's showing that year, we had many social programs. We had free busing to prison for those who have loved ones who are incarcerated, showing those interconnections of overcoming those obstacles, showing we had the free ambulance service in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, because the ambulance was reluctant or wouldn't come into the Black community. So we Panthers went there, got certified, and got an ambulance license, and the community helped them buy an ambulance. So we had a free ambulance service in Winston-Salem, free health clinics across the country. We had free food giveaways, free bags of food. Wherever we had chapters and branches across the country, we gave free food. We had senior citizen programs. It's called SAFE, Seniors Against a Fearful Environment. We had alternative schools, where we had one of the best alternative schools considered in the state of California. You had people like Rosa Parks and others who came to our school to visit and make contributions during that time. Here's a more recent one I did, playing off of Survival Pending Revolution, a historical one I did. But this was done for a young man, and then we're gonna have it in the book on COVID. But here again, showing the free busing to prison program, the free ambulance service, free breakfast for school children served here, Mondays through 7 to 9 p.m. Yeah, free clothing giveaway. We had those things, all those kinds of, and it was to point out the contradictions of what the government wasn't doing, to enlighten and to inform about the issues that existed. Here's mother's love. This is father's love here. This is called mother's love. Reparations, dealing with the words. And I was inspired by an African brother who did a book on African alphabet. I can't think of his name, but he did this book, and I was inspired by some of in the book they had some of the designs were made with different figures and those kinds of things. So I was inspired by that. Here's the xenophobe, fascist xenophobe. Trump, and he is, no matter where he turns, he's still lying, don't make a difference. Decolonization of the psychological. Here's when he called Africa, Asian, all black countries, shithole countries. And so this is the shithole president. So this is showing understanding when you talk about immigration, you're talking about white only. You're pushing every people of color black out. Here's the deal again, ice cold wickedness. Mama, mommy, papa, separating families. All these things is going on. Ethnic cleansing, the mass expulsion or killing of members of an unwanted ethnic or religious group in society. Guilty. Peace heals, war kills, which shows what war has done to human beings, the psychological impact. You're trying to inform and enlighten and educate. You're talking about Mother Earth, and you got the doomsday clock, about 2 minutes to midnight at this point in time. Talking about Mother Earth. You have the glaciers breaking, melting. People on these islands and stuff within the next couple of years won't have a place, won't be able to live on those islands, won't even survive. This is to respect Mother Earth. Black Lives Matter, Justice Now, Black Lives Matter. Arab, Muslim, Islam, US government coded word for terrorist hate, discrimination. Black male, US government's coded word for hate, discriminate, kill. So you have to be provocative, but you have to be able to articulate and communicate what you say. You have to be, because if you challenge, you have to be able to articulate why you did this, how you put it, what context you putting it in. As much as things change, some things stay the same. Why do they get to brutalize and murder us and we get to blame? Police terror, USA. This is the first one I did of this. This is when Oscar Grant was murdered in Oakland. And since then I've revisited on several occasions in different shapes and forms. This is called the Black Code. This is about the justice system. A Black person has no rights which a institutional racist judicial system is bound to respect. It gives the appearance of being fair and just when the biased decisions have already been decided. This is in collaboration with an Aboriginal artist named Richard Bell in Australia, 1968 Olympics. Peter Norman was in solidarity with them at the Olympics. He wore the badge for Olympians for Human Rights. He, thereafter, when he went back to Australia, he had the best qualifying time for the 1972 Olympics, but they blacklisted him. He was never allowed to run again because he supported John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the 1968 Olympics. So they wanted that history to be known. They asked us to do to young folks today, back then. This is Tuxtla in Chiapas, which is Zapatistas. Been there, done some work with them. That's me in the store being invited. And about 15, 16 of us come back the next year and we did the store. That's the store you just seen in collaboration. These are some of the images that you've seen on the store itself. This is the up here, the Zapatista dials. These images here are some that I contributed to the work there. It was about solidarity, production, cultural. These are Mayans. This is the Mayans that we are talking about, who went to war. The Zapatista went to war with the Mexican government in 1954 because of NAFTA. They said that was a death knell to them. But now they've turned internal, begin to develop their own kind of economy, but at the same time, they're still being attacked and murdered by the right-wingers in Mexico. Here are some of the images of mine that were Mayan interpretations in the images. It was played off of Zapantera Negra, Zapatistas Panthers, Zapantera. That's what it's play off of, showing solidarity. Again, Black solidarity and brown solidarity. Yeah. This is at elementary school. in Oakland, California, where I was invited to do a presentation. Here, this is Urbis in Manchester, England, where I was invited to do with these young people who building their self-esteem up. And just the very fact of them acknowledging whatever the art that they do, that's fine. But the fact that they were highly respectful and knew my history, that was an opening in relationship to being inspiring to these young people. This is the exhibition itself. This exhibition had desks with reading material connected to it that were required reading by the Black Panthers. That when people came in, they sit at these desks, they could read the same information that we had to read, or they could see video and audio clips of materials. And this exhibit had 43,000 people come through it from October 2008 to April 2009. Here's the opening reception of it. This is in New Zealand. And when I was by the Elam International School of Fine Arts, they wanted me to come to do an artist in residency. And this is on the streets up by the university. And they had so much interest in the history of the party that they had to cancel the artist in residency per se. And I traveled for 41 days to the North and the South Island, talking about the history of the Black Panther Party. This is in New Zealand in a library where they're talking about an action in relationship to land being taken or being used and exploited. And they want to get some idea on some graphics. So I'm talking to young people there. This is when I met some Polynesian youngsters in New Zealand at an all-boys school, amazing artists, who I was invited there. This is a Maori symbol. It's called a single twist symbol. You say we may go different ways, but we may go different paths. We always come back together. And I had to do a design for the country, where the Maori artist named Wayne Yule. And they said, "Oh, that's just a simple design." But I said, "Well, I'm gonna have to see how I can impact it." And I used this twist design with the Maori flag to come up with the design that I did for that. And this is the design I come up with. And in Maori, it says, and they interpreted what it meant: overcoming oppression is our path to unity, to interconnection again. You're dealing with cultures and identity in the context of how they inspired. This is Argentina, being there, try marching, young people, 5,000 to 6,000 from Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay, everywhere, who come to this event that they had in Mar del Plata, where they brought in designers that they had because they felt they didn't have qualified designers. And you do a 45-minute talk or what have you. You have big screens, big movie screens on each side, interpreter, all those things are there. This is after the talk. This is in a big national basketball stadium. Out in the corridor, young people were selling their artwork. Outside, they had them playing, they had skateboarding and music and entertainment for them. In between that, you come back in. I was wondering, they gave me about, like you go to opera and you get about 7 or 8 curtain calls. And I was trying to figure out why was that? And it come to me that they could see in the artwork the same determination, resistance, and suffering and pain in the artwork that they're dealing with in their lives, in the context of their country, but in that context. This is in Portugal. Every floor they had artwork going up the stairs, the whole bit. Yeah. This is in Nottingham. This is in Bogota, Colombia. So this is up, you go up and down the streets, you see the work as you go up and down. This is in Bogota, this is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Ceci, it was an amazing exhibition. They had me all on the elevators. This is the opening night, getting prepared for the opening. This is opening evening. This is in Oakland, California. Artists in solidarity with Palestine, 9 different artists. This was my contribution, Free the Land. I had, recently I came back a couple of weeks into the process because I had been invited to Concordia University in Canada. So I had to come in and work, but there was many artists working together. there was a Palestinian a sister who sent her design to be done by Susan Green, who's American Jewish. You had Afrocentric artists. You had Japanese American artists. You had American Arab artists. You had indigenous artists. You had artists from Jordan. So you had a whole, and we had many, many helpers worked on this with us. Here's with the young Palestinian kids taking a photograph in front of the mural. Free the land by any means necessary, boycott, divest, down with apartheid. This is in Africa at Arusha, Tanzania. When I was there visiting in Arusha, Tanzania with comrades we have who are there and they wanted to do an image. This is about the 1% that's going on, you see, endangered species. All these things you have to deal with. The decolonization of the imagination, mental bondage, all those things. When you're dealing with this, you're trying to show them youngsters that they're enslaved mentally, those kinds of things. There has to be that kind of visuals consistently though, in order to transform the mindset. This one here is done in New Zealand with some youngsters who I was invited, and they liked that other image you just seen, but they wanted to deal with what they don't call them tattoos, they call them mochas. But they wanted the word peace to be the symbol on the artwork. So this is what we came up with. This is when I was first invited, my first time. The Maori, Tamaiti, they met me at the airport, gave me official welcoming to the land. They're social justice activists, artists, and performers. They charged them, they're from Tuhoi. They charged them with terrorist charges in 2007, I believe, because they were practicing shooting on their own land. But what happened when I first went there, they had arrested them. And the next couple of years later, I went back, they had to apologize because they arrested him and all the charges had to be dismissed. Because the whole thing was they refused to budge on their negotiation with their land rights. So therefore they tried to demonize them in the eyes of the public. This is what we see today, property, modern day slavery, prison industrial complex, private property, justice integrated again into it. Political prisoners who were mentioned on the delegation, Mumia Abu Jamal, Leonard Peltier, Native American Indians, who was a part of AIM, American Indian Movement, who were our allies and who acknowledged that they were inspired by the Black Panther Party back in the day. This is why they started AIM, the American Indian Movement. This is at the Lorraine Hansberry Museum in Tennessee. That's the location where Dr. King was assassinated. When they turned this into a museum, they wanted to have a social justice aspect, political aspect to it. So they asked to work out an arrangement agreement to do this picture that I've done called All Power to the People, to be a part of that exhibition that's still there and will be there, I assume, until otherwise. And this is the last one, a remix of that one. This is a more recent one called All Power to the People, and try to make it a little contemporary with the song phone in the hand and that kind of thing there, what have you. So that's basically the artwork. And so I just want to read just a couple of paragraphs, and then that would close out my part of the presentation. It's called Art Guided by Principles. Art with vision, intention that reflects the people's desires and aspiration is an art that is guided by principle. It transcends borders, thus becomes universal in all of its many creative expressions in support of the people's movement for liberation against all forms of oppression and injustice. Therefore, as an activist artist, it's our duty to create art that's not separated from the people's concerns, but rather reflective and interpretive of those concerns. Art that informs, informative, enlightening, and inspiring, that could potentially contribute as a guide to action. Therefore, we must continue using images and symbols in all of our art forms that enhances and reinforces self-determination. So that's just a brief statement that I made on art. I hope that this is the end of my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Douglas. Really appreciate that. You taking us around the world, taking us everywhere globally. I know it's a COVID pandemic, but it makes me kind of wish I had a passport to travel to all those places. So thank you very much for that. At this time, we're gonna transition to the next part of our panel with Nirzin Keswani. If you wanna tell us a little bit about what it is you have here to say. I think you should be able to find the button, Mr. Douglas, up there in terms of muting. But Nirzin, the space is yours. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I want to start by recognizing here in New York, I'm on Lenape land, and this is not our land. And, I go more into national questions of indigenous people and also the Black nation later on. But, we all have different experiences with that, as well as, many Black people did not choose to come to this country either. And I just want to start off by saying I'm deeply honored to be on this panel with you all, always learning so much from Professor Rabab Delhadi and Machidisu, who I was supposed to and wish I could have met in person, at the event that you mentioned. And of course, Emory Douglas, whose work I've admired and have been inspired by for so long as an artist and an organizer. I'm trying to keep this short, so I want to just kind of go into more about the work that we do than give any introductions about my organization within our lifetime. But I do want to start off by saying, I think, it was really great to hear Rabab mention the Black and Brown student strikes in California, because I believe that, our organization has really been impacted by that. Many of us, many of the people who started WOOL actually went to Cuny, the City University of New York, which is the largest Black and Brown university system in the country. And this has really informed our politics, getting to learn from and be a part of the legacy of Black and Brown organizers in this country who've really paved the way for us. It was a 1969 Black and Puerto Rican student strike at Cuny that had open admissions, that pushed for open admissions because, they actually used to call City College of New York, one of the Cunys, the Rhodesia of Harlem, because it would just be this white enclave in a Black community. And of course, this brings us to questions of gentrification, or colonization, urban colonization, since with the critique that Rabab mentioned is very important to keep in mind. But, this has really affected the trajectory and, what Cuny stands for. So I went to Cuny in undergrad. I'm in Cuny law now, and a lot of our organization is inspired by this legacy. We prioritized centering the uprising this past summer and have been centering Black liberation from our organization's inception, because we know that the best thing that we can do for Palestine from the United States is actually fight for Black liberation as part of a global anti-imperialist struggle for the liberation of oppressed nations. Because as Bobby Seale said, the best care package we could send to liberation struggles around the world is the continued and intensified resistance to the fascist repression from the same enemy here in America. So I just want to start out, I want to think about our struggle and our struggle solidarity and the basis of it between the Black nation and the Palestinian nation. And I believe what the main basis and the first thing to discuss is internationalism. We know that the Palestinian people are an oppressed nation, but what people don't recognize often or frame in this way is that the US is also a house of oppressed nations, including the Black nation, the Chicano nation, Indigenous First Nations, and many more. And we're both facing a national question here. Harry Haywood wrote about this in the Black Belt thesis, which also really informs our political understanding on this. And we know that the history of internationalist solidarity between Palestinian liberation movement and the Black liberation movement dates back extensively, as Rabab has discussed. But in recent years, these linkages have seen growing resurgence in the US and around the world as the mass surveillance, criminalization, incarceration, and murder of Black people in the US and Palestinian people in occupied Palestine by the US and Israel has continuously revealed itself to be a collaborative project. And that this growing consciousness has led to the realignment of grassroots struggle and popular resistance, uplifted by Black and Palestinian communities and movements targeting the state and corporate entities that are waging genocide against our people and displacing us from our land. So understanding ourselves in the context of oppressed nations as colonized people is an integral pillar in our solidarity and struggling with one another. Second, we also must uplift the struggle of political prisoners because this is another form of joint resistance that has reemerged in recent years, and which is the prison strikes being waged by Palestinians in Israeli prisons and Black and brown prisoners in the US prison system here. From the Palestinian prisoners movement, which organized a massive hunger strike in 2017 and continues to resist the Israeli occupation from the inside through ongoing strikes, to the national prison strike that took place in 2017 in the US against the system of modern prison slavery, we see expressions of mutual resistance strategies and solidarity. And I want to take this moment to highlight the struggle of Maher al-Akhras, Palestinian political prisoner, who is currently about to enter his 93rd day of hunger strike in protest of his indefinite detention without charge or trial by Israel. And I wanted to just take this moment to urge everyone to look into him, his campaign, and support as much as possible because this is a very critical moment where he could face a lot of irreversible damage. But you know, I believe that this implores us to understand that our role here as a Palestinian-led organization and as Palestinians in the US is also to continue to expose that the oppression of Black and Palestinian people is a collaborative project between our oppressors. And we must work towards a more coordinated popular resistance. And our struggles for liberation must also be coordinated in response. We also see our role as continuing to strengthen and build organizational ties with Black anti-imperialist organizations who are struggling for liberation of all oppressed nationality people, and to support one another in the areas of political education, strategy building, campaigns, and community work. You know, not just slogans of solidarity, and you know, not just panel discussions, which are great and and are really a place to talk about this and bring it together, but it also needs to be brought out into the communities, into the streets, and not just you know, behind like the ivory towers of academia, which you know, as Rabab says, even if you're fortunate to, you know, make your way into that, it's still you know, their property. They're still able to silence us. They still, you know, it's not our arena. You know, we have to build our own spaces and not just rely on constantly being on the defense in these spaces, or, you know, assuming that our community always has access to this. So just, you know, bringing those two worlds together more than, you know, criticizing, you know, anything else, because I think it's a great basis to actually bring our community work into academia to make these connections and to tear down, you know, these walls, this gatekeeping that tries to keep us separate. And, you know, I just want to touch briefly on different ways that, WOL has practiced solidarity with Black liberation as inspiration to other Palestinian organizations looking to do the same, and also as a way for us to learn from, others how we can do more. But we know that from the very beginning of our organization, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement was crucial to the development of the politics of what became within our lifetime and the Palestine movement at large. In 2014, some of the most pertinent work of SJP chapters in New York City was support of BLM protests, paralleling the support from Palestine to Ferguson protesters. And participating in these mobilizations situated ourselves as participants not only in the fight for a free Palestine, but as fighters in a worldwide struggle against imperialism everywhere. We're also in coalitions with organizations, Black liberation organizations that we've built with over the years, and always ensure that, at our rallies, at our events, that there's moment for popular education for people from our community to learn about Black liberation, whether it be through political prisoners or our shared history. Most recently, political prisoner Mumia Abu Jamal has called into our rally in Brooklyn here against annexation. We've campaigned for his freedom, continue to uplift that campaign at that rally, as well as the freedom of all political prisoners. So when we talk about Palestinian political prisoners, also to understand that exists here, and the fight is the same, and we must be fighting for both. We also organized the Palestine Lives Conference with Existence is Resistance, another amazing Palestinian-led organization, because we both believe that internationalism must be a key theme with emphasis on Black liberation, and inviting and uplifting leaders in the movement, like elders from former political prisoner and Black Panther Sekou Odinga and Deki Kioni Siddiqui, to Mark Lamont Hill, who we've hosted numerous times and who we've actually protested for outside of CNN when he was fired for his remarks in support of Palestine at the UN, as Rabab mentioned. We believe that we must have events like this to actively facilitate education for youth from our communities about Black revolutionaries and political prisoners. This was the event that we were talking about earlier. We've worked with Black for Palestine to organize a Black-led delegation of grassroots organizers that included Indigenous, Arab, and Mexican organizers across the US. It was the first delegation of progressive oppressed nationality organizers since the 70s and 80s, when Black organizers and political parties forged important relationships with the Palestinian refugees living across Lebanon. The goals of the trip were to share and educate one another on the richness and histories of our struggle, to show that they've historically been connected. And most importantly, this trip reaffirmed our commitment to struggle solidarity. So I didn't want to go past 8:30 so we can have a full half hour for Q&A. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. And I particularly appreciate sort of kind of to begin to weave all of this together. I think some of the points that you brought up around popular education, anti-imperialism, and sort of the need to extend these conversations beyond sort of these parameters dovetails really well with Mr. Douglas's work about art. And perhaps since we are here, at RISD, thinking with people who are making and creating artwork, perhaps there are ways that maybe in the Q&A or later we can think about, I think this may have already come up in the chat, but how artists perhaps, maybe Nirzin, to your point, have a unique role in being some of the people who can push the work beyond the boundaries that it often gets enclosed in. So thank you all for that. I'm gonna hand it back over to Aya, and yeah, let's go.
Yeah, so we can start going over some Q&A questions now. And I guess, Nirzin, since you were just talking about how you still face censorship in academia, can you briefly touch on how your experiences have been with this and how we can combat this as students who actually want to engage in these issues, especially like as designers and as writers at the school?
So as many of you probably know, I'm facing a lot of these issues now with attacks about being anti-Semitic, which is an accusation that's always levied against oppressed people whenever speaking out against Israeli colonialism, against our own oppression. I mean, I'm Palestinian. How can I be anti-Semitic for literally fighting for my own struggle, you know, and let alone other people being vocal on that. But we know that whether in the US, Europe, or Western funded institutions, unfounded accusations of anti-Semitism are not only exploited to protect Israel, but also stifle discussions generally about racism, imperialism, and state violence, which creates a climate of fear in imperialist centers, deterring intellectuals, journalists, and the public at large from exercising free speech regarding controversial issues that should be publicly debated. And so we know free speech was never really free. Since the emergence of Zionism, they've always identified their project with Euro-American dominance, and this is replicated in the academic space, being part of the same process of militarization of campuses, white supremacist curriculum, and general privatization and austerity measures. This aim is nothing less than replicating an ideology necessary for the functioning of empire. For example, you know, at Cuny, we had the Morales Shakur Community Center named after Guillermo Morales and Assata Shakur, which was seized by the administration around the same time that the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership was established. This was also around the same time that Netanyahu's brother came to speak on campus, and around the time that the attacks against Palestinians at Cuny, including ourselves, began. Tuition hikes, the hiring of war criminal David Petraeus, and the Zionist attacks were all part of the same process. Each campus was targeted by Zionist-funded student groups, which would use rage and feeling unsafe or targeted. You know, this is also racialized language. You know, why do you feel unsafe from us just speaking about, you know, our struggle? And, you know, they capitalized off of that general fear from Arab Muslims, from people, you know, with darker skin than them, from Black people, from Arabs, to have this like white victimhood complex, which is also exploited. You know, Zionists get to enjoy this complex as well. You know, and they stifle our ability to raise awareness and solidarity with the Palestinian calls. This actually got to such a wild level here because in 2016, New York State Senate, angered by the negative rhetoric and intimidation, you know, around, you know, they're saying that this was caused by SJP against Jewish students, threatened to withhold millions, around 485 million to be exact, in funding, unless Cuny fulfills a vague request for a plan to respond to anti-Semitism on campus. So they spent all semester, I mean, a couple semesters actually investigating us. They talked to me, my professors, student leaders all across the 5 campuses, and actually came out with a report that said that all these accusations were completely unfounded. But of course, they only did so after we graduated to try to stifle us while we were still there. And now we're seeing this happen through the use of bots, trolls, and applications like ActIll, which launched astroturfing campaigns by issuing missions to a troll army in exchange for cool prizes and scholarships to overwhelm a target, which usually are organizers, like with myself, and manipulate public discourse. And these tactics and services, which are now marketed as, you know, easy to use and deploy, being taken upon by many governments, they direct comments towards new websites in support of Israeli wars and racism while attacking Palestinians and solidarity campaigners. So, you know, they literally have to resort to these wild tactics, whether it's serving lawsuit after lawsuit to having these, you know, well-funded manipulation apps that are literally connected to the Israeli army. And, you know, these efforts, by the way, have millions and millions of dollars pumped behind them to try to just pump the brakes a little bit to try to slow down all the amazing gains that Palestine organizers are making on campuses and across the US. So I think, you know, continuing to move forward in the face of these like attacks allows them to continue to deplete their resources, trying to take us down, but they're not able to, because as long as we maintain our principles as long as we maintain our unity and we don't give up on this, at the end of the day, they're throwing money down the drain because we're beating them for free. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you. We just received a question that's open to anyone to answer. What do you think the process of decolonization looks like under a white supremacist colonial system that seems to hold so much more power? How can we continue to feel motivated when we continue to be set back in our progress?
I think I want to actually direct this question, if I may, to CD and Emery. And, I can always weigh in later on. Yes.
Thanks.
I mean,
Rabab.
people are asking about under white supremacists because, I mean, like the Zionism is, a lot of it is white supremacy, but it's a particular kind. So I think people are actually asking specifically around the whole question of Black liberation. So, I mean, I'm happy, but I will wait. I think I think the whole comparative aspect of the US and South Africa is actually really, really good and makes things much more concrete. So maybe CD.
Okay, thanks, Rabab, for putting me on the spot. So I think if I understand the question properly, it's so how do we go on? How do we continue in the face of this continuing attacks, etc., and also in the context of really emboldened white supremacy and fascism? I think, if the South African experience is anything to go by, is to, teach us that life is long, one, and two, that there is really no deadline for justice. You don't stop just simply because a Zionist tells you, that accuses you of anti-Semitism. I mean, we have our comrade Bongani Masuku, whose case is still at the South African Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land, being accused of anti-Semitism for simply calling the Israeli occupation of Palestine for exactly what it is, an ethnic cleansing project that is genocidal. So, we have all these things where it's getting so ridiculous that the main arguments of Zionists with this case of Bongani Masuku is actually getting to a point where you can't even believe some of the stuff that they say. So you can't call someone Zionist because by saying Zionist, you're being anti-Semitic. But, so what are we getting at? What are we ever getting to a point where we can't criticize Israel? And this is South Africa, we criticize everyone. So we're really getting to a point where a lot of, free speech and vocalization of the injustice, especially around Palestine, is increasingly stifled. I mean, Nadine just spoke about, stuff that happens with students, student protests, students' rights to strike in South Africa. I mean, the 2015 Fees Must Fall movement kind of saw an explosion of this, where students started speaking about decolonization and Black liberation, what this means. At the University of Cape Town, where a statue of a colonizer, Cecil John Rhodes, stood right in the middle of campus, and Black students had to walk past this man who was literally, committed genocide, mass genocide of Black people in Southern Africa, colonized the whole of South Africa. He had even a whole country named after him. And white students and white professors wanted to defend as a very, offensive statue of Cecil John Rhodes on campus. And what this happened was, conversations around who can speak and who cannot speak came up. A lot of the students in the Rhodes Must Fall, because Rhodes Must Fall came first before the Fees Must Fall movement, and Black students said, white people have been speaking for 400 years in South Africa. It's time they shut up. And the reason you have to say these things is because you have to get to a point where your voice as an oppressed person has to take authority. Because this is your experience, you cannot have anyone else stifling that voice. as I said, if the South African experience is anything to go about, we had had 400 years of colonialism and apartheid, where Black people had been fighting since the 1500s when settler colonialism entered our shores, through the Portuguese, later the Dutch settlers, and then the British. And then the formalization of the racial capitalist system of apartheid then came in 1948. So there is quite a lot of proactive agency that has to happen in terms of solidarity and activism. That has to be very relentless because they're also very relentless, unfortunately. And I think that it's, as activists and supporters of Palestine, and also champion our own struggles as Black people, we have to kind of take a step back and realize that we have made so much gains, and we are actually winning despite what the general rhetoric, the general public utterances are. I mean, in South Africa, lots of Zionist financiers have control of the media. They have control of, things like TV, newspapers, etc. So of course they get a bigger platform than we do, but that hasn't stopped us, and that shouldn't stop us for now, I think. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to touch on this question, or should we move on to another?
I'm waiting for Emery. I want to speak, but I want to wait for Emery.
Oh,
Unmute yourself. You're muted, Emery. You're muted.
Thank you. Well, actually, when you're dealing with the decolonization of the imagination, or you have to, when someone can define you, they can negate you as a human being. So that's the bottom line: is that you're trying to overcome those challenges and obstacles that you're confronted with and bombarded with on a daily basis, and particularly when you're living in the belly of the beast here. So you have to be able to always be aware of what's going on, and you have to be able to define it and articulate it in a way that even a child can understand it and get something from it, because that's what you're trying to do. You're setting the stage not just for yourself now, but you're also trying to prepare it for young people coming after you. So you have to speak a language in relationship to that they can get something out of it. You have to so it's defined. So that's it. That's the bottom line. Yes.
I want to say something. Okay, so I'm going to just build on what Emery and CD said. I think that we've seen a lot of this past period, a lot of kind of like statues of the Jim Crow, of white supremacy, of settler colonialism, and so on fall, which also brings up what CD was talking about in terms of South Africa and Rhodes and so on. And for the Palestinian context, and I know, Emery and I and others went to actually visit the Palestinian communities in Naqab, who were actually completely, delegitimized by the Israeli state. And so they found ways to do it. But then also the whole question, when you go around and you see all the roads names changed, you see all the villages erased, you see all of this stuff. What this erasure mean to people who are actually continuing to insist on their existence and their living and so on and so forth? So I think for me, it's kind of every single time I see a statue falls, I see a Columbus statue fall, I saw a Jim Crow fall, I see roads fall and so on. And to me, it's another victory for Palestinians. I mean, really. And so it also becomes also a question of kind of saying, well, this is what happens. This is what happens when you're driving around Palestine and you see all these Hebraized signs that actually intend to erase. And what do we do about them? And what does this mean? And the fact, and for me, is the fact that actually younger kids, Palestinians in refugee camps who are even fifth generation, and I'm not talking about refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza, or internally displaced Palestinians in the 48 areas, or the Naqab communities that are completely organized. I'm talking even about Palestinians who are in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, throughout the diaspora and so on, still remember the villages they come from. And they will say to you, this is the village I come from. And then they will come and say, oh yeah, but you know, this village has been destroyed on this and so that this is where it is. This is where I can locate it on the map and so on. So I think this to me says a couple of things. One is that, as I think Siti said, that the history is a long history. We're in here for the long haul. We're not going to go away, I think. And I'm saying that as a scholar activist, as a Palestinian, as somebody who has a conscience. That's A. Secondly, it also says how important it is to bring this stuff in terms of actually intellectual discussion. You know, I think it's really, really important for us to have the discussions with all our communities. It's very, very important for us not to let go of the academic sphere. We're all here on an academic place. We are here, every one of us in one way or the other is an educator, because, and I think when people say only intellectuals are in the university, I'm like, okay, that's what you want to say, but that's not really the reality. You know, we know this is not the reality. We know that a lot of educators are not really educating, are just, you know, collecting a salary and basically making gains or what. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about individualized gains. I'm talking about actually being committed to the things we believe in, both in the spirit of 68, in the spirit of what the Panthers did when you did all of these things for kids. I mean, if kids' stomachs were not full, how are they going to learn? I mean, this is kind of like something that people think, oh, it's just some kind of a luxury. It's not a luxury. You need to have, you cannot be hungry in order for you to be able to hear. I mean, you have to be able to eat. Or when the young lords actually went and collected the garbage in the El Barrio. And I think this is kind of like people, and for me, it reminds me of people who built, and we were on the delegation in Palestine. One of the villages we met was Surra and Hiran. And there is this settlement, Zionist settlements, that's being built by the Jewish National Fund. And the people are actually trying to figure out how to do solar panels, how to feed. The kids come in and they smile and they talk to you and so on. So it's kind of like, I mean, it's almost an impossible thing to do, but it's possible to do. And I think the reason it's possible to do because there is a community that comes together and says, you know what, we're not going to allow this to happen. We're going to continue to protect our future generation. We're going to continue. And I think also, and in that sense, also the whole question of the struggle against internalized colonialism and the whole internalization of what is acceptable, what's respectable, and what's not. Oh, you shouldn't be doing this. This is not really acceptable. But when we ask acceptable to whom? Who do you need legitimization from? Are you asking for legitimization from your own community? Are you accountable to your own communities? Or you accountable to the structures, the institutional structures that are actually trying to destroy you and your communities? I mean, it's very, very difficult, by the way, game to play, especially in the academy. We all know that. It's very, very difficult because not only they come up with all sorts of like very sanitized ways in which to describe things and so on. Sometimes they don't even seem to be what they are all about. But that's what management do. That's what corporations do. Think of the academy as a corporation and think of the academy as management. And think of you as somebody who's in the ground trying to actually hold on to your job and your rights and your communities and so on. It happens again and again. And it happens, if we look at the history of the movement for Black Lives, the history of the uprising, the history of Palestine and so on. One of the biggest tools that the oppressors use is to actually call us uncivilized, combative, unprofessional, angry. You know, angry is like a lot, you know, kind of like, we're not entitled to our anger, but, you know, white fragility can cry all they want. And everybody says there, and so on. So even the whole manipulation of emotions, the manipulation of real emotions, of community, and you know, we are in our communities a lot of the time say, we're not going to cry in front of the oppressors. We are actually going to have each other's backs and so on. We can cry on our own, right? So all of these issues, I think, are really, really important. And by the way, they are very legitimate topics to discuss and talk about. But we are not allowed, when you are in an oppressed situation, you are not allowed to actually come up with all these things. You are supposed to behave in a kind of respectable way. You're supposed to behave according to westernized, colonized structures and so on. You're not supposed to do all of these things that actually are quite criminal, that are actually inhumane. And I think this is kind of like where it's a question of kind of like, how do we even talk about it? And then there's all these people in the middle who actually come in and weigh in because they think they are the philosophers and they think they are the ones who own knowledge and so on. And I think it's really, really important for us. This is a very big battle for us to fight. Delegitimizing the status quo and the colonized knowledge and the ways in which it oppresses us and says to us that You know, it's okay for you not to be starving. It's okay for you not to have a job. It's okay for you not to have healthcare. It's okay for you to be silenced and so on. It's okay for you to be looking at you. How come you're dressed that way? How come you're speaking that way? And so on. And I think it's really, really important for us to challenge all of these things, because if we don't challenge them, also it is a question of enabling and empowerment of younger people. I mean, maybe those of us who are much older and so on, kind of been there, done that, we know, and it doesn't mean that doesn't affect us. It does affect us. But we've sort of like, we've already got trained, right? Emery, I mean, we've already been through it. We've done it so many times. We know what it is. But for younger people, every single time, this is actually one of the first sort of like, let's say, the checkpoints they need to go through. And I'm using that actually very deliberately. The checkpoint that they need to go through, because the checkpoint is not something that you construct yourself. It's a checkpoint, you have to go through it. You have to wait for the military occupation to let you go through it. They can let you go through it, they cannot let you go. They have the power to do it and so on. If we think of things this way, we are actually able to think of ways in order for us to enable the empowerment of our youth and our communities to be able to do what they want to do. And actually also not to set limits on their imagination. Not to actually basically, I mean, decolonizing the mind is one of the most important things.
Thank you for that. If I may quickly, speaking of decolonizing the mind, I just wanted to there are a few questions in the chat, in the Q&A for Mr. Douglas, and I'm going to try to combine these together quickly. But what I'm getting from a few of the questions there, and this does kind of come off that point of imagination, I'm wondering if you could just talk to us a bit about, again, thinking about our students, a lot of them artists, particularly right now, who I think are really wrestling with how to enter in terms of activism, right? I think in a state where there's things like heightened surveillance, capitalism, sort of like the arm of the state is in many ways everywhere. And for folks who, you know, maybe you show up at an action and there's a question like, who are you? Why do you want to be here, right? So I'm wondering if you could speak about, as an artist who's worked with so many different communities around the world, how did you, or how do you continue to, like, what's your ethic? You know what I mean? Like, of showing up in these communities, how do you build with the folks? Again, you've worked with people all around the world who are interested in decolonization and liberation and struggle. So I'm thinking, really love to hear maybe you talk a little bit about what's important for you when you enter in relationship or in struggle with these different communities all around the world, and how is that part of your decolonizing imagination? I hope that was clear. So,
yeah. Well, basically, when I go there to learn. I don't go there to try to teach them, talk. You know, if I'm asked or to respond or do something, then I will. But I'm going there to be informed and to be enlightened. So that way I can integrate. I can work with whatever it is that we're there to do together as a collective. I always ask when I'm invited. Plus, you have to understand, I've never have marketed anything. Everything has been because of people being informed or enlightened or been inspired by the historical context of what the work comes out of and what have you. Everything has been, and that has been in the context of how I've gone to my travels. Now, when I do go, I ask, like, for example, when I first went to Australia to work with Aboriginal artist named Richard Bell, I asked him about the prison system. And he said at that time, yes, they were just beginning to privatize prison. That was in 1968. And that Bechtel was one of the companies there that was beginning to do privatizations there. You know, I asked about the, you know, the highest rate of unemployed, highest rate of those incarcerated, indigenous people. Same thing you find out in New Zealand. You see, so you see a commonality in the context of things. So I go there in relationship to, in collaboration and in learning from what exists there. Because, you know, you got cultural differences that you have to be mindful and respectful of, you know. And, you know, you come in there with this so-called, it's almost like an addiction. You can come with a Western perspective thinking you know the world, you know, when you got a whole other dynamics that exist in these different locations where you go that are specifically to those areas in the world. So you have to respect that, be mindful of that. Yeah.
Mhm. No, thank you. Really appreciate that. Aya, yeah, if you want to take it back over.
Or probably, we have time for like one more question. In many instances of physical resistance in the US, in Ferguson, for example, we saw that the Palestinians and Black Lives Matter entered into a magnificent mutually informing dialogue based on their common experience with the brutal force of the law enforcement forces. How can this dialogue be sustained, especially when there are different ends in mind? How can the demand for the right to return, for example, resonate with the Black community in the US and elsewhere?
I'm going to just say one thing about this. I actually think that if we only, first of all, I don't really like to use the term law enforcement because it actually normalizes it and makes it seem as if it's actually the right, this is the right of the people to come. And we need to also understand from our own studies, all of this stuff is constructed. The whole policing, the whole torture, the surveillance, all of this stuff is constructed. None of it is actually has been there forever and ever and will continue to be there forever. So it's not really our fate, okay? So I think really the second aspect of it is I think if we actually reduce things to only think it is about the right of return or it's about this and that, I think that becomes very difficult for us to arrive at a framework of the indivisibility of justice, to think about what does this mean and how it plays in different things. Because even if we're not talking about Palestine and a Black liberation, even if we're talking about a particular Black community or a particular Palestinian community, it becomes very, very difficult to actually reduce everything to only one thing. Because you may win a battle on one thing, but they're going to lose in the long run. I think if we actually think about the framework, refuse to accept the framework that the oppressors give us, and liberate our minds and get beyond that. And I will just end by asking a question for all of you at the Rhode Island School of Design. What you're going to do about your curriculum, how you're going to revise your curriculum to decolonize it in order for this conversation to continue with the faculty, with the students, with the community, with everybody else. So I'm just going to stop at that, but this is kind of like my point.
I also just wanted to jump in for 1 second and really kind of go back to what I was talking about, understanding Palestinian and Black people as colonized people, as oppressed nations, means understanding that we get to have self-determination. We get to determine our future. And whether that looks like the right of return, whether that looks like physical resistance here or resistance back home, this is why Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. We have the right as oppressed people to resist our oppression and to fight for our liberation however we want, and we must be supported whatever method we take.
Okay, thank you all. Just to be mindful of time, we should probably end the panel here. So I just want to thank everyone again for joining us this evening. Biggest thank you to our panelists, Dr. Rabab Delhadi, Mr. Emory Douglas, Master and Nirzin Keswani. And the recording of the panel will be made available afterwards to the community. So you will definitely find it linked on our Facebook page description. And our SJP will link it on our event too and send it out in emails to our listservs, which you can be added to by reaching out to us. We're definitely going to have more events this fall. So we do invite all attendees also to be updated with that and keep in touch with other conversations that we plan on having. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for all the work that you've done to make this happen. Thank you for the students, for the faculty, for Professor Roberts, for Aya, for all this. This has just really been, for me, it's been really great.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
We're reunited with all my comrades and my homies.
Good job.
All right, thank you, everyone. All right. Shout